Hey guys, today I'm sharing an update in my No Pan Left Behind challenge. I'm having so much fun with this project. I've completed all the palettes in my current round, so I am going to rotate in a completely new set of palettes. I decided to make some small changes to how I do this as I'm just kind of learning as I go. If you want to catch up on the previous two videos in this series, I'll link the playlist, even though it's a very short playlist, down below. But the overall goal of this project is to use every pan of eyeshadow in my collection at least once in 2025. So at any given time I have a basket of palettes that I'm working on completing, and so I want to share my thoughts with you on all of these palettes now that they're finished, meaning that I've used every shade in each of these palettes. So let's start with the two that were rolled over from round one. These have been in the project basically since the start of the year, so I'm very ready to roll them out. And this is one thing I've decided to change up how I do. So this is my magnetic palette, and these, with the exception of ColourPop La Playa, the round pan, all the other ones were randomly generated from my big palette of magnetic singles, many of which are depotted, and then there's also just some regular magnetic singles in there. But instead of randomly generating the shades from now on, I want to just hand pick them to complement the pre-made palettes that are in that round. So I think that'll just make it easier because this was just such a random slew of shades and it was not fun to work with, honestly. I mean, yes, I had fun with the shades on their own, but I didn't feel inspired at all by this random assortment. So I don't want that to happen again. I think it'll be way more fun to just pick the singles that I think will kind of complement the palettes that are in the round. My most used shade from this 9 pan was ColourPop La Playa. That's the one that's also in my 7 by Spring project pan. So far I've used it a total of 8 times. You can see I have lots of progress in there. Still no pan, but I think it's very close. And aside from that, I used all the rest of the shades 1 to 3 times. The shades I used 3 times were Villa, the light pink up in the top here. This was a great light peachy pink for the crease, for like a transition shade to start out any sort of pinky rosy look, which I ended up doing quite a few pinky looks. I also used the shade Malibu 3 times. That's this light peach shimmer. The shade that I struggled to use most, the one that I ended up using last, was the shade Guava. This is depotted from the BH Cosmetics Mimosa palette. It's just so bright, and it's not often that I wear colors that bright, but I am glad to have that sort of color in my magnetic singles collection because that's where I think that kind of lesser used color makes the most sense to belong in my collection, if that even makes sense. Anyway, I'm really happy that I dipped into all of these shades, even if it took me quite a long time. I think my new strategy with magnetic shades will work a lot better. Another goal of the No Pan Left Behind is to decide if I want to declutter each palette or single, in this case, that I'm using. And actually, after using this whole palette, I don't want to declutter any of these shades. I think they actually all are really good to have in my collection. It was just kind of this combination of shades I didn't love. Then this is the other palette that I rolled over into round 2, and this is the Kaleidos Escape Pod. I have been going so back and forth on whether or not I want to keep this palette. Also, the other day, randomly, as I was using this, the entire palette fell out of the packaging, and the shade Galactic Gala, which I would say was probably one of my favorite shades in here, fell out onto the floor. So there's just like a tiny bit left in the bottom of that pan. I still can't decide if I want to keep this or not. As you saw, it took me like 2.5 months to complete this palette. I think I probably would have liked it more in the summer just because these are more summertime shades to me, especially like the shades that took me the longest to get to were the hot pink, the bright orange, the coral, the purple. I think it's really those shades. Like there's just a lot of that. And the look I did using those shades, it was a combination of this palette plus some of the pinks and peaches, basically that whole middle column in here, plus the light pink in the corner. And then I also used the silver shade Cyborg from ABH Sultry in the inner corner of that look. That was a really fun look, and it made me tempted to keep Kaleidos Escape Pod, but then I realized that I could do a very similar look using a lot of the depotted magnetic shades that I already have. As you see, I actually think I could have done a similar look using just these shades. I think if Galactic Gala had not fallen out, I would have been a lot more tempted to keep this. That was like a lime green shimmer, really, really pretty. There's also this green shimmer down here, but this one is more golden olive than Galactic Gala was. I think what would make this palette something I'd use more often is if it had maybe just one other light matte, kind of at the same depth as Bossa Nova, which is a nice taupe, but I wish there was also like a light peach matte in here because it just kind of goes straight to really bright corals and oranges, and I need something a little bit lighter to kind of blend into those. But I think I just struggle with this combination of shades. The shade in here that I ended up using the most, no surprise, was Lo-Fi, the light matte. I use that kind of shade often to set my eyeshadow primer or to sort of clean up my brow bone a little bit. The next most used shade was a tie between Bossa Nova, the light taupe matte, also not a surprise, and then Starlight Sonata, that peachy shimmer. That is such a gorgeous shimmer. Really loved that. Then everything else I think I used just 1 or 2 times. The shades that took me the longest to get to were Flamingo, Tango, Carnival. I struggled to get to those. I kind of actually had to force myself to use them. And the look I ended up with I liked. It was fun. I just don't feel that strongly about this palette, so I think I'm going to declutter it. In total, I got 6 uses out of this palette, meaning that there were 6 days that I dipped into this palette at least for one shade. But a lot of the times I was using it, I felt like I was forcing myself to use it. So that tells me this one can go. Then Sigma Cool Neutrals, I really enjoy this palette. It leans a little bit deeper than a lot of my other palettes, so it's great for more smoky looks. I ended up using this palette 5 times over the course of this round, but every shade I either used once or twice. I didn't really end up going back to shades multiple times. I think I kind of defaulted to Sultry for neutral shades when I wanted them. I think that's why I didn't end up dipping into any of the shades like a ton of times. My most used shades in here, it was a tie between like 5 of the shades, but these were the shades I used twice. Fossil, Iris, and Angel Wing. Those 3 shades are so pretty. I also used Harvest, this light warm brown matte, and Talisman, the dark eggplant purple shade. So those were the shades I used twice. Everything else I used just 1 time. I think the last shades I ended up dipping into were Thunder, this like kind of charcoal shimmer shade. I think I ended up using that as a sort of shimmery dark winged liner. I also think it took me a while to get to the shade Laguna, this mauve shimmer. I think I just like some of the other shimmers in here more, so I don't end up dipping into that one as much. One type of look that I continued to do a lot in March was a mint chocolate chip look. I've been doing a lot of those because I'm working on hitting pan on this ColourPop La Playa shade, this really pastel mint shade. So I've been pairing it a lot with browns, and there was yet another look I did like that this month with that shade plus Sigma Cool Neutrals. I used Harvest in the crease, this sort of warm-toned light brown, then Volcanic on the upper lash line, that's this dark chocolate brown, and polished this shade on the middle of the lid, and then I also layered some of this shade, that's Coastline, depotted from the BH Summer and Saint Tropez palette. So I layered quite a few shades together, and then of course ColourPop La Playa. I really do love that mint and brown combo. So I think it goes without saying, but I will be keeping Sigma Cool Neutrals in my collection. ABH Sultry was definitely my most used palette of this round. I used it 11 times, and that actually makes it my most used palette of the year so far. So that's cool to see because I really do want to try and hit pan on at least 1 or 2 shades this year. I did have a goal of hitting pan on a shade in this round. Clearly that didn't happen. My most used shade though was Fresh. That shade just comes in handy a lot. My next most used shade though was Cyborg. I just wanted to use that shade almost every single time I used this palette. In fact, I think I really stuck to kind of like this little trio here, Cyborg, Slate, and Bloom. I love those 3 together, and that's another color pairing I found that I really like this past month, was a peachy coral with a silvery gray. I like to call it like a smoky peach look. I think that is one of the prettiest, most unexpected color combos. I usually don't think to pair coral and gray tones like that, but they are actually so fun together. And there were also looks I did not involving those 3 shades that I became obsessed with. Like Rose Quartz, there was a look I did kind of centering that on the lid and then having Twig in the crease. And that was just kind of an example of like a quick throw it on type of everyday look for me. And I think I did that sort of look several times as well, just taking Twig and then one of the other shimmers. I'm really happy to see this palette looking more well-loved now because I've had it for a long time. And prior to like end of 2024, I felt like it really didn't have much progress, much visible progress on it. So I just absolutely love this palette. I think it's so fun, such an easy palette to work with. So definitely, again, it goes without saying, but I'm obviously keeping this one too. And the last palette from this round is the Nomad Royal Europe palette. This one was fun to play with, but I ultimately decided to declutter this one. I feel like that probably doesn't come as a surprise. There were a few shades in here that I had never touched in the 2 years I've had this until it was rolled into this round. I think it was Hall of Mirrors, The Ballroom, Paina Palace, and then Great Hall. Those, like that little L right there of shades, I had never used. I do love jewel tones, even sometimes as eyeshadow. I think they're really fun, especially like blues and greens. But there is so much like berry and red in this palette that just makes it overall, I think, just not the palette for me, even though I think it's a fun, inspiring palette. I think the layout with all the multichromes at the bottom is really fun, but for me, I just think it leans so bold and so deep, and there's so much berry in here that I'm rarely going to touch. Even among the multichromes, which are really unique, and that's kind of what kept me holding on to this palette for so long, I don't feel like any of those are super unique. I have so many other fun, interesting, shifty shimmers that I don't think I'm going to really miss any of these. That being said, I did do some fun looks with this that got me out of my comfort zone. There was one look I did actually in a video. It was in my video on neglected makeup, and I used a combo of Royal Europe and Kaleidos Escape Pod. I ended up with a really bright blue-green look. One thing that this project has really gotten me more comfortable with is bright, colorful looks. I just feel like in general I've been doing a lot more colorful looks kind of out of necessity, like because I have to complete these palettes. I mean, I don't have to, but I'm trying to. It's just gotten me out of my comfort zone. So really happy about that, even though ultimately I have decided to declutter this. I only logged 4 uses on this palette total, meaning there were 4 days where I dipped into at least one shade in the palette. I used every shade once except for the shade Royal Orb, this green, gold, and blue multichrome. Very pretty. I would say these two multichromes are my favorites. I actually think a lot of the shades that I like out of here and the Escape Pod, my Nomad New Zealand palette has a lot of similarities. I'll bring that out. Obviously, like, you know, these two have a very different vibe. This is the Nomad New Zealand palette that was actually in round 1 of No Pan Left Behind, and then this is Royal Europe. This one also has some really fun metallic shades that I think I just enjoy a little bit more. Like this peachy gold one is so fun. I'm actually realizing that 2 of the shades in here look really similar. Bleu de France in Royal Europe and then Milky Way in New Zealand. Let's swatch them side by side because I am actually really curious now. Are they the same? So this one is Milky Way from New Zealand and this one is Bleu de France from Royal Europe. I mean, they're really similar. Not the exact same, but close enough. Actually, another similar couple of shades I just found. Southern Cross from New Zealand and Royal Treasure from the Europe palette. The top one is Southern Cross from New Zealand and the bottom one is Royal Treasure from Europe. So different but similar enough, and again, I like the New Zealand one better. It's like shinier. Both of these also have a deep matte purple. I also just kind of like the pink in here more than the like really red magentas in Royal Europe. And then it also has a matte peach. So I'm just much more inspired by this one. And then also when I think about the shades in Kaleidos Escape Pod that are kind of unique to my collection, like the pinks and peaches, again, I just am kind of more inspired by the more muted pinks and peaches of New Zealand stargazing. So I feel like this project already is giving me such a better understanding of what palettes I like, what shades I actually use, and what palettes make sense to have in my collection. Even though, like, Escape Pod, I can appreciate this palette, it doesn't mean I need to keep it. There are just other things that suit my preferences and needs better. So anyway, I've already found some overlapping shades between this palette and others that I'm keeping, and I just think this palette could better suit someone else. I think it is really fun. It's just not the palette for me. I really found it a chore to use it. And actually a strategy I found this round for those shades that I just dread reaching for, that I'm kind of like I don't even want to use that shade, I will have a makeup playtime. And I know it sounds like I'm forcing myself to use certain shades, and I kind of am, but that's also the fun of the challenge and the project, because I created this look that I'll pop up on the screen. And I ended up layering basically just all the shades from this palette and then some from Escape Pod, and then also ColourPop La Playa, that mint green. I layered a bunch of shades together. A lot of like the blues, the purples, all the shades that I just hadn't used yet. I also managed to throw in some of these reds and pinks all at the same time because I just wanted to knock this palette out and be done with it. And then from Kaleidos Escape Pod, I had on the shades Soiree, Mardi Gras, and Cosmic Cabaret. So as you can see, for this look, I just ended up layering up a bunch of shades and just kind of going nuts. This was a look I did, it was like after work, so I already had makeup on. I think I actually already had on the ColourPop shadow sticks in the shade Bear With Me, which is this like nude kind of rosy brown matte shade. That's what I'd had on for like 8 hours already, and I decided before I took a shower and washed my face to put on just like a crazy eyeshadow look. So that's what I did, and that's been a really great way to get some use out of these shades, even if they're shades I don't necessarily like have an occasion to wear them out of the house. A lot of these are shades I just don't reach for often, so it's kind of fun to just sit down and say, okay, how can I mix and match and just create something kind of out of the ordinary for me. Then there was also a look I did with this plus Kaleidos Escape Pod, but I had on the like light kind of mustard brown and then some of the green and gold shimmers, and I didn't really like that look, to be honest. Like, it was a pretty combination of colors, but just on my skin I feel like those kind of mustardy browns just don't end up looking flattering on me most of the time. One more look I wanted to show, because I actually did pull out the Nomad Ireland Wild Atlantic Way palette because it was March, it was St. Patrick's Day, so I wanted to use this one at least a couple times, and there was a look I did using this in combination with the Nomad Royal Europe palette. But I did get some compliments, even though I myself didn't actually like the look that much. But I used, from the Nomad Ireland palette, it was like a pink and green look. Fun look, again, but I just felt like it looked kind of weird. I think if I had worn a more pink lip, I would have probably liked it more. I think the lip I chose was too brown. Yeah, I had on the Estate lipstick in Fluffy, which is a very kind of warm nude shade, and I think I should have stuck to like a more pinky lip. And then I topped that with the Lawless Juicy Watermelon Gloss. I think I just needed a less brown lip, honestly. That was probably my biggest problem. But from the Nomad Ireland palette, this was not part of the No Pan Left Behind round, but I just pulled it in to use this month. I used Connemara and Wild Atlantic Way in the crease for just a light green. I think I also mixed maybe some of Danny Boy in with that. And then I used the shade Savage Beauty, the silvery taupey olive color, in my inner corner, and then in the center of the lid I ended up using the pink multi-chrome from Royal Europe. This is the shade Royal Treasure. That's what I had in the center of the lid, and then I also had on the dark brown matte as like an upper smoky winged liner. So that was a pairing that was fun, just a fun experiment. Love Nomad Ireland. I think this is just like the ultimate green palette. That wraps up the recap of round 2. Happy to say that all of these palettes are completed. 2 of them are leaving my collection, and it feels good to really be making informed decluttering decisions because I really have studied these palettes quite closely. So now you know what time it is. It is time to pick a new round of palettes, and I could not be more eager. I use an app called Tiny Decisions to create a wheel of all my palettes. I've taken out the ones that have been completed from the project, and now I'm going to just start generating some. Sigma New Mod. I was just thinking about that palette. Sigma New Mod has a ton of like pinks and berries and mauves. I overall think this is a really pretty one for spring. So I'm going to select probably 4 and then see how I feel if I want to pick a 5th one. Nomad Verona. I'm actually curious to see if I decide to keep this or not, because I struggle with the such different sides of the palette. Like really I just wish that the 2 sides were separate palettes, because I think really what I want to keep is this side. But we'll see what kinds of fun looks I can come up with the red side. It's spring, I'm definitely in the mood for colorful shadows lately, so I think it's a good time to play with that one. Those are actually 2 kind of big palettes. One is a 14 pan and one is an 18 pan. So I might actually just stick to 3 palettes. We'll see what we get for the 3rd palette and then we'll go from there. ABH Norvina. Ooh, I'm excited for that one. Lots of pinks this time around. This is another 14 pan, but it is slightly more neutral. Let's go ahead and pick a 4th palette. Let's just pick one more. Sigma Ambiance. I'm actually glad I went ahead and picked a 4th palette because I think this one is going to counter those really pinky mauvey berry palettes that I got with just some nice neutral warm browns, which I love. So I think this is actually a very well balanced selection of palettes. We have some bright colorful shades, but also plenty of neutrals to work with. Okay, so I went into my singles collection and hand-picked some shades that I thought would complement these other palettes well. I thought this would be a good way to pick some shadows that I'm just in the mood for seasonally. So as we get into spring, I always love pastels. So I picked out a bunch of my favorite pastels from my singles collection that I hadn't used yet. And I also wanted to show you my system for keeping up with the shades that I have used and haven't. So I'm putting all of my completed magnetic shades into this palette. So here we have the ones that I just finished. And then in this big Cleona palette, I have all the rest of my singles, the ones that I haven't completed yet. So this is what I pulled from. And the only shade obviously that is going to be rolled over is ColourPop La Playa as I continue trying to hit pan on that. All of these square shades are depotted from BH Cosmetics palettes. I thought it would be handy to have a matte white in there because this is just good for mixing with any other color to make it more pastel. This is the shade The Abbey from the BH Cosmetics Lost in Los Angeles palette. I also wanted more green in general because of all the palettes that I randomly selected, there really was not much green. These palettes definitely covered a lot of like pinks, reds, purples, those kinds of colors, but I definitely wanted some greens for spring. So I also grabbed Dreamer from the BH Cosmetics Lost in Los Angeles palette. I of course wanted a pastel yellow as well. This is the shade Intoxicating from the BH Summer in Saint Tropez. And then for a light peachy pink, I picked out WeHo from the BH Lost in LA. This is a matte. Also for just a light beige transition color, there wasn't really anything like this in any of the palettes that I selected, nothing this light at least. This is one of my favorites. This is the shade Sand from the BH Saint Tropez palette. I obviously already have a pretty big pan in this. I love this shade. I thought it would be nice to have just one more neutral matte as well. And then I also picked Champagne from the BH Mimosa palette. This is another like golden peach shimmer, kind of similar to that Malibu shade from the last round, but this one is just even a little bit more like chunky and sparkly. These other two shades are ColourPop. This is just a ColourPop single in the shade Howland. It is a matte pastel lavender. So pretty. Had that for a very long time. And then this one is depotted from the ColourPop In a Trance palette. It's the shade Future Self, but that's a pastel matte blue. So most of the magnetic shades I chose are matte actually. The only ones that aren't are that peach and of course La Playa, which was already in there. So I just wanted to supplement some more just other pops of color besides red and pink. So to kick off this round, I want to do a palette bingo with one of these 5 palettes. So to continue the fun of random generators, I've pulled up my Pretty Random app, put in numbers 1 through 5, and I'm just going to number them in the order that they are in. So we have the Magnetic palette, Sigma Ambiance, Norvina, Sigma New Mod, Verona. 2. Okay, we got Sigma Ambiance. This will be, I think, an easy palette to do a palette bingo with because it is so monochromatic. But nonetheless, I think it'll be really fun. So what I'm going to do is randomly generate 5 shades from this palette to create a look with. So I put in numbers 1 through 14 into my Pretty Random app, and let's generate some shadows. So we got 11, 8, 10, 14, and 3. So first, shade 11 is the shade Summer Solstice. It's this rusty brown color. Then shade 8 is the shade Firefly. There's that. The mid-toned bronzy shimmer. Then shade 10 is the shade Burnish. So a slightly deeper bronzy brown. 14 is the last shade, Sunflower, this yellow gold. There's that one. So far, all these shades look really nice together. And then the last shade we got was shade 3, and that is the shade Oasis, another rusty matte brown. So there's our color palette. I honestly think any random selection of 5 shades from this palette would still create a cohesive look. So I'm going to start out with that first shade I swatched, Summer Solstice, to start out my crease since it's the lighter of the 2 mattes I got. I already primed my eyelids with the Too Faced Shadow Insurance, so I'm just going to buff that shade Summer Solstice into my crease with this brush that came with the palette. Right off the bat, we're very warm toned. So then I'm going to flip the brush around to the more flat side, and I'm going to pick up some of our other matte shade, Oasis, and I'm packing that above the upper lash line and just kind of blending it up to meet with Summer Solstice. Oh, you know what I just realized or remembered is that I have been counting uses in palettes, even the ones that aren't part of my current No Pan Left Behind round. So in February I did use the Nomad Verona palette once or twice because it was so perfect for Valentine's Day. So I've actually already completed a few of the shades in this palette. Now I'm picking up some of Burnish. That is the deepest of the shimmers I got, so that's the one I'm going to start with. And I'm actually going to layer that over Oasis. Not all the way to the outer corner, but just kind of overlapping the two. So that I'm kind of placing in like the outer half of my lid. And then next I want to dip into the shade Firefly, which is the lighter kind of taupier shimmer. I'll actually just pick that up on my finger. And that I'm placing on the inner half of my lid and bringing it to overlap with Burnish. And then I think I'll just take a little bit of Sunflower. That's the last shade, the only one I haven't used yet, the gold. And I'm just tapping that in the very center of my lid, kind of closer to the lash line. And I think on my lower lash line, I just want to take some of Oasis and Summer Solstice. So those are all of those shades. We'll have to just do without an inner corner highlight because I don't think any of these are light enough for the inner corner. I guess I could do Sunflower in the inner corner, but I don't really want to. I think I just want to keep the gold in the center of my lid. And then I think this look would look great with a brown winged liner. So I'm using the Fenty Fly Liner in the shade In Big Truffle. Okay, so I finished off the eye look with some brown mascara. I used the e.l.f. Lash Extender, of course. Then on my lips, I went with just a caramely brown nude. So I have on the NYX Duck Plump Lip Liner in Subtle Touch, and then the Estate Cream of the Cream lipstick in Fluffy, mainly in the center of my lips. I love this look. This is very much like a go-to look for me in the summertime, but I actually really love it. I cannot wait to play with all of these palettes throughout the next few weeks and see how quickly I can complete them, especially considering, like I said, I have already used a handful of the shades in Verona. From this side, I've already used Paradise, Cupid, Love, Comedy, and Quill. So I've already used 5 out of those 9 shades, so that's awesome. Then from this side, I've only used 2 shades, Morse and Death. That'll actually make it a lot easier, and I might actually complete these faster than my last 2 rounds have gone by. So I'm having so much fun with this challenge. I'm so glad I decided to do it this year. Let me know if you're doing something similar and how it's going for you down below. If you want more content from me, I'm going to leave some videos linked on the end screen that you might want to check out next. Otherwise, I hope you all have an amazing rest of your day, and I'll talk to you very soon in my next video. Bye!